For a period of roughly 30 to 60 years, the stories about Jesus, his life and teachings, were passed along by word of mouth. That means that from the time that he lived until the time that these stories were recorded in Scripture, written in the Bible, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were being transmitted orally. When they were in this form during that time, they're known as the oral tradition. Have you ever played the telephone game? I used to play it every year with my scripture classes. I give one kid a secret to pass around the class during the class period. And when it finally got to the last student, we find out what they heard and then compare it to what the first student received from me. It was always a complete distortion. So if I told the first student something like, Josh broke up with Melissa because he saw her talking to Andy at the football game, it would turn into something like, Andy broke Josh's leg playing football because he doesn't like Melissa. That's a great example of what happens when we try to communicate things orally. Often they get incredibly, grossly distorted. And that's just one sentence. So how are we supposed to trust this oral tradition that lasts 30 to 60 years? This oral tradition that contains 3 full years of Jesus' life as public ministry. How are we supposed to trust this oral tradition that undergirds the Gospels, everything we know about Jesus? Trust that it's anything more than one big game of telephone. How are we supposed to trust that oral tradition accurately preserved who the real Jesus is? A couple weeks ago, we had a guest, a missionary, speak to us at church. She works in a culture that is still primarily an oral culture. So they can't just hand out Bibles to share the story of Jesus with people. They have to figure out ways to communicate that story orally. She did an exercise with us during the service that showed some of the ways that they do this. So she had all 400 of us, so about 400 of us in the service, listen to her tell the story of Jesus healing the blind beggar Bartimaeus. She didn't allow us to open up our Bibles to look at the text. We had to do it simply by listening to her. The first time she told it, she invited us to close our eyes if we wanted to and to imagine the scene, even put ourselves in the scene. But then she told the story a second and third time, and when she did that, she would prompt the congregation to fill in some of the details. She would leave some of the details blank and have us, from our first hearing of the story, begin to fill out those details, which we could easily do. People could easily give her answers to her questions based on that first hearing of it. Finally, she split us up into these small groups where she asked some very directed questions. Again, without being able to use the text, without being able to open our Bibles, we had to answer some very directed questions that teased out the meaning of the passage, which people, based on comments that they shared with the larger group when that exercise was done, which people seemed to have no problem doing. When we left church that day, my wife was telling me how amazed she was, how quickly that story stuck with her, how easily she could learn it so fast. She wasn't familiar with this story. She had never read it before in the Bible, and she doesn't think she ever heard it proclaimed before. At least she can't remember having that happen. And yet that story was easy for her to learn, to remember. It stuck with her. But what amazed her more was the fact that she gained more insight into it by hearing it orally than if she just read it from the biblical text. Somehow, hearing it orally enabled all of us who were there to really feel it. We could feel the desperation of Bartimaeus. We could feel the fickleness of the crowds. And most importantly, we could feel the compassion of Jesus. So here we were, not steeped in an oral culture, very much not an oral culture. And just doing that exercise enabled us to have that story stick with us, and not just stick with us in a way we could accurately remember it, remember the details of it, but in a way that we actually could glean the deeper meaning of it. So imagine what it would be like for people who are steeped in an oral culture to learn those kinds of stories and to accurately retain them. People like those who were transmitting the oral tradition about Jesus. Modern neuroscience has revealed some incredible things about our minds, including our memories. And while it has completely reaffirmed the fact that when it comes to mundane things like where you left your keys this morning or what you heard in a game of telephone, our minds are terribly faulty. We tend to forget a lot of things, be very inaccurate in our memories. When it comes to something they call emotionally charged events, those kinds of events leave a vivid imprint on our memory, and we're able to remember them with great accuracy over long periods of time. Events like a first kiss or the birth of a baby or even a humiliating childhood moment. Those kinds of events leave a vivid imprint on our memories. So for example, while you may not be able to remember where you placed your keys this morning, you probably remember exactly where you were on 9/11. You probably remember exactly who was there when you first heard the news about 9/11. You probably remember the expression on their faces and what you talked about in the wake of first hearing that news. You probably even remember some of the incidental details in your surroundings that you normally don't notice. That's the way it works with emotionally charged events. They leave a vivid imprint on our memories that enable us to remember them accurately over long periods of time. But what's more, modern neuroscience has discovered that our brains can't tell the difference between what we actually see, what we actually perceive and experience, and what we imagine. So when it comes to these vivid events, our minds can't tell the difference between what we've actually experienced firsthand or what we've been told, as long as we imagine it. We can remember these things with just as much accuracy for just as long a period of time if we've only heard about it, as long as we've kind of let it percolate in our imagination in the process of hearing about it. Much of what Jesus said and did qualifies as emotionally charged events, vivid events that would stick in people's memories. Things like his provocative parables, his shocking teaching, his scandalous association with sinners, his heated controversies with the religious leaders, his mesmerizing miracles, and his poignant compassion for the most marginalized. Those are just the kinds of things, according to modern neuroscience, that would leave a vivid imprint on the memory of those who experienced them firsthand, and a vivid imprint on those who heard the story about those things, provided that they imagined them in the process of hearing them, which is often what people in oral cultures do. So, according to modern neuroscience, the oral tradition would preserve fairly accurately much of what Jesus said and did. The Gospels, it turns out, are much more fact than rumor. They do give us a very clear picture of who the real Jesus was. There are a number of other really good reasons to trust the oral tradition. I'll get into some of those in future blogs. Surprisingly, these reasons have been produced very recently, in the past 10 or 20 years, by other disciplines of modern scholarship. But what about you? Do you trust the accuracy of the Gospels? Why or why not? Let me know what you think by going to the Raising Jesus website, the Contact EJ page, and leaving your comments there. Also, would you please consider helping get the word out about this ministry by liking the Raising Jesus Facebook page, subscribing to the Raising Jesus YouTube channel, and telling your friends about us? I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.